All right, everyone. So we've moved just past 2:30, so it's going to be time for us to get going. And now, since this webinar is going to be on self-care, I recommend you find yourself a nice and cozy spot. Maybe bring over a cup of tea and prepare to listen to our guest speaker. And while some of you are grabbing that tea, I'll just cover some of the housekeeping notes. And that starts by introducing myself. So I'm Michael Taylor. I serve as the Membership Development Supervisor for Early Learning Ventures. So we here at ELV, we run a childcare management system that helps members with their business and administrative needs. If you've appreciated this webinar series and aren't using any kind of system in your childcare currently, I'll include my contact details just in our post-webinar messaging. We bring this kind of care to all of our interactions with our providers. But let's just take that and move it aside, because we aren't here to talk about business or administration. In fact, some of us are here today specifically to not talk about it. So let's skip right ahead then and introduce our topic and guest speaker. So today we're going to be joined by Ella Young, a Chicago-based therapist who specializes in trauma, anxiety, and grief for Balanced Awakening P.C. She's going to be walking through some of the mucky feelings that many of us are feeling these days, as well as walking through the importance of self-care and providing some simple examples and tips. Personally, I'm very excited for this, not just as your moderator, but also as an attendee. And I also want to let you know we've saved time for questions at the end, so please feel free to type them into the chat at any point using the all panelists option. I'll be keeping an eye on the chat and will serve as our chat sounding board too, Ella. Finally, about an hour after this webinar ends, we'll be sending along a recording of Ella's presentation, as well as a link to her slides, just in case anyone has to hop off early. Also in that post-webinar messaging is going to be some information about the ELV resource platform, which is something that we've opened up for free for all Colorado-based EC professionals for the rest of 2020. And again, you'll also be able to reach out to me if you have any questions on it. But that's really the housekeeping side of things. So I feel comfortable that we're ready to pass it over to Ella. So Ella, please take it away.
Okay, thank you so much, Michael, for the introduction. And thank you everyone for allowing me to come speak to you today about such an important topic. It's super neat to be able to reach out to communities outside of my own, like let alone across state lines. So this is a pretty fun opportunity for me too. Let me see here. I'm going to go ahead and share my screen so you can see my presentation. Let me just get this set up. Okay, so hopefully everyone is seeing the Coping with COVID-19 presentation on your screen right now. And Michael, let me know if not. So today, my goal is to really talk through just the wild and craziness that we've all been going through for the past several months. I think this topic is so important because we need time to stop and reflect on the impact of what's been going on, and then more importantly, discuss the different types of coping skills that we might be able to apply to kind of manage our day-to-day a little bit better, which allows us to do our jobs better, especially if you have multiple roles, like I'm pretty sure everyone who's watching does. So before I jump in, there's actually a couple things on the screen that I want to highlight first. The initial one, honestly, being my title. So I named it Coping with COVID-19, Managing Your Mental Health, and then in parentheses, it says the best you can during a pandemic. Now, I added that in for a little bit of humor, but I'm also kind of serious about it. I want to talk about self-care. I want to talk about the importance of coping, but I really want to underscore the fact here that we are trying to do the best we can. You are already doing the best you can, and maybe with a little bit of knowledge or a few more tools, we can enhance that, but it's not going to be perfect, and that's okay. And I think that's honestly probably the first thing that we need to keep in mind when talking about something like this, because we are in the middle of a pandemic, and none of us have ever been there before. The second thing I want to highlight is how I structured the visual of my presentation. So the ripple effect. In the middle, where I'm going to start, is talking about the actual impact of what is going on, because the reach of it is so like pervasive. It reaches so many facets of our lives, of our world. It's almost overwhelming. And I want to be able to just put words to some of it and relatedly narrow on our individual responses and be able to group kind of like what's happening in terms of any kind of symptoms, um, any kind of reactions that we're having to this thing. On the flip side, with coping, I also want to approach it as a way of a ripple effect. And what I mean by that is I think we can plant a lot of seeds regarding coping. And through practice and through nurturing, we can have these seeds grow. And this is like self-care, what I'm talking about that's growing. And ideally, it can outlast the pandemic and actually serve to help us later on when we face other kinds of stressors later on in life. So really, I hope the heart of this presentation, if you can pull any little piece out of it, it can stay with you well beyond this is over and well beyond like into whatever the next phase of our lives are. Okay? So let me get into the presentation itself. Let's see here. There we go. Now, I'm not going to go through every single point on each slide, but I do want to highlight the ones that I think are important, and then you all can also go back over it later. The impact. So COVID-19, what has been going on? Well, as of yesterday, when I looked, 1.4 million cases of COVID were identified in the US alone, and 83,000 deaths have been identified associated with COVID. So this is a lot. We know this. 36 million Americans have also filed for unemployment. That is really staggering to think about and really just, I think, puts into perspective how far this is reaching. So not to mention the shelter-in-place orders and all of the different restrictions that have been placed on us that have completely changed our lifestyles, whether it's our work lifestyle or our personal lifestyle or home lifestyles. Everything has kind of changed in some way. No one is protected from this. And then also as like a collective species, we are having to adjust to so many significant changes that impact all of us. And it can be something similar, like seemingly small, like sports, or the fact the Olympics have been postponed, which has only happened like twice, to the fact that some of us just no longer feel safe outside, which is really like unprecedented to think about. Now, Michael did say that I have a specific interest and specialty in trauma work, and how I interpret and conceptualize what's going around us is through a trauma lens. I think it fits and I think it's appropriate. I would identify this as mass complex trauma, and I just want to spend a couple of minutes talking about why, because I think it puts into context how impactful this can be for all of us. So I consider it traumatic because there's really a direct or indirect threat to our lives, our livelihood. That's what's happening. There are multiple losses happening at the same time. I've already alluded to some, not just physical health, but our livelihoods, our ability to see friends, our ability to go outside. This is all happening at the same time, and it's a collective experience. Vicarious trauma is also happening. So even if, say, like day to day, your life is actually like okay, like it's being altered, you're having to adjust, but like generally it's all right. You are likely being exposed to other people's stories as well. So especially if you're childcare providers, for example, if you work directly with children or you interact with families, I'd be willing to bet all of you, if you're not directly impacted right now, know somebody who really, really is, who's really traumatized by it. And being empathic people, being people who care, you can internalize that as well, and it can have an impact as well. So keeping that in mind, I want to go over what are some reactions that we might be experiencing as a result of this pandemic. And I want to start a little bit broader and initially talk about our stress response. Some of you might be familiar with this already, but I think it's important because it puts into context a lot of the symptoms that a lot of you might be feeling. So it's the fight, flight, or freeze response. I imagine a lot of you might have heard of this before, but I'm going to, oh, sorry, one second. Okay. Hopefully that's not too loud. I'm sorry, my air turned on. I don't know how to turn it off. Maybe, Michael, you can text me if it's too loud. But I'm going to keep.
Just some nice ambient background.
Okay. All right, then I'm going to keep going. Sorry about that. So, the stress response, right? It can be categorized into three main categories. The fight one, the fight response, is described as anger, irritability, muscle tension, because your body is trying to get ready to fight this threat. The flight is about isolating, running away, or feeling panicked. And then the freeze response is about having difficulty with deciding on what to do because you're so overwhelmed. And this can be described as detachment or a feeling of helplessness. So when we interpret a threat, this part of our brain called the amygdala will activate the stress response, and you'll experience a category of responses in these categories. Now, what I want to say about the stress response is that it is automatic, so it's involuntary, but it's meant to keep you alive. The thinking part of our brain and our frontal lobe up here actually gets overridden by this stress response, which is important to keep in mind for later, because it doesn't want you to think and try to analyze everything if your life is literally in danger. It's going to override it and activate that stress response and try to get you moving to keep you alive. Now, the thing is, if this system gets activated a lot over a short period of time, for example, like in a pandemic, it can become more easily triggered. The threshold for it can be lowered. So, you know, every day, especially I say in March and April, there always seemed to be a new headline, a rule to follow. Is it safe to go out or not? These are very stressful things. And even if it's not directly life-threatening in the moment, the amygdala is picking up on that stress and it wants to respond in a certain way. So this is important to keep in mind in the context of the pandemic because it's involuntary, but it's low key kind of on all the time now for all of us. So keeping that in mind, I do want to talk then about the different kinds of responses that the stress response can initiate due to the pandemic. So cognitively, this might look like trouble with memory, focus, attention. And as I said before, it's because that stress response is literally trying to override the thinking part of your brain because it's worried and it wants to do something different. This can look like a distorted sense of time. I think there have been a lot of jokes out there about like, what day is it even? I don't know. Like, did this happen yesterday or 2 months ago? I have no idea. I had a couple of clients no-show me, and it was because they literally forgot what day of the week it was. That is not on accident. Trauma can impact the brain and the stress response in such a way that your sense of timing is a little bit off, which makes it really hard to do certain things or to, for example, like run a business. Inability to make decisions, intrusive thought patterns. So this is like a domino effect. I wonder how many of you can identify with this. This is like having a thought of, okay, the shelter in place is about to lift and I don't know whether or not I want to open my program, but if I do, what if then X, Y, Z, and that just keeps going on and on and on, and it feels impossible to stop. So this is something that can happen. Now, emotionally, I bet a lot of you are feeling a lot of these emotions. It can really manifest in a lot of different ways. So, of course, difficulty finding joy and satisfaction when we're feeling so limited. A sense of unease is really salient. I know for me at this point, I have a general new routine. It's somewhat predictable. I can get through it. But in general, I feel also a little uncomfortable. It doesn't feel quite right. And it's not necessarily sadness or anger, but it's uncomfortable and it can be kind of irritating. So maybe some of you are identifying in that way. Grief is also a big one, and not just if you happen to know someone who got sick, or God forbid you knew someone who's really ill from it, or you got sick yourself. It's about grieving losses. If you were designing a new childcare program and you were going to launch it this summer, I bet it looks different, and people can grieve over that loss and not recognize that. Irritability and agitation is pretty common because of that fight response. Mood fluctuations as well. So during a day, feeling multiple intense emotions at the same time, that is pretty common as well. And not feeling that emotional stability and not knowing why, not having a reason. And then with dissociation, that goes back to that freeze response that I talked about. And basically, it's if you ever had a sensation where the world around you no longer feels real and you're just kind of detached from it, like you're okay, but you're just kind of floating, that's called dissociation. It's protective because it's meant to distance you from something scary that's in reality, but it also makes it really hard to do things like plan or think or engage with others. And then finally, body responses, because the mind body connection is really real and it can manifest in a lot of different physical symptoms as well. So, fatigue, I know for me in March, I was exhausted and slept a lot more than I typically do, and I could sleep really easily. But sleep changes can also go the other way when people are stressed out. So, lacking sleep, waking up a lot in the middle of the night. Your appetite can change as well. Crying spells, and then, of course, some hypervigilance to the body. Maybe some of you, now that we all know the symptoms of COVID-19, you know, the scratchy throat, the dry cough, some flu symptoms, at least at the very beginning, there were a lot of people who were ruminating on like, do I have it? Is that what that is? I have an itch in my throat. Oh my God, what if that's what it is? I'm sure that's what it is. And you start Googling and you start like, trying to figure out, are you supposed to call a doctor now? That kind of hypervigilance um, to the body can actually increase anxiety. And then, unfortunately, that anxiety can actually feed back into the body and actually make you feel that kind of symptom. It's really an unfortunate thing, but it's also good to know because we have some power over how our mind and body connects with each other. And I'll go into that in the next section of coping. Okay, so that was just a very quick summary of what kinds of stress responses we all might be feeling. I'm sure there's probably more that some of you are experiencing, and I would love to hear it if this was like a different forum, but this is just meant to kind of categorize into groups what those responses might look like. And therefore, when we talk about coping, I can address it in that way as well. So, in terms of self-care and coping, I wanted to start off with some basics, starting with basic needs. Whenever we're stressed out, the first thing that usually goes out the window is eating well, sleeping well, and any kind of exercise. That usually gets thrown out the window. I used to work at a university counseling center, and around finals, all of my clients, none of them were eating nutritionally. No one was sleeping. They hadn't worked out in like a month, and it was really really hard for them to get back on track. However, this is a great place to start if you're wondering like, how on earth can I take care of myself? There's so much to think about. Well, let's start with the basic things for survival. So, eating consistently, eating best you can, staying hydrated, maintaining a sleep schedule. So this means trying your best to go to bed and wake up around the same time every day, and then be intentional about good sleep hygiene. So what sleep hygiene means is your bedtime routine, increasing effectiveness for sleep. For example, keeping your bed really clean and made, not bringing screens into the bed because that keeps you awake. It means blacking out other light as well. And you can Google sleep hygiene for like a longer checklist, but it is really just meant to keep the sleep routine consistent. So then your brain understands and associates that it's time to actually shut down. Exercising is pretty self-explanatory. I think the only thing I'll say about that is you don't have to do like a HIIT class or even yoga. Stretching counts, walking counts, standing counts. If you're at your desk the whole day, try standing for a second on a phone call or pacing. That will be really helpful to get the blood moving. Now with mindfulness, I'm actually going to try to lead us in a little exercise in the next slide. But the thing I want to say about mindfulness right now is I think a common misconception of mindfulness is that it's meant to help you think about nothing. It's meant to just dump your mind and you can just be present and zen. That is one way to look at it, but in my humble opinion, it's not the most helpful way, especially in times like these when there's just so, like there is a lot to think about. Asking you not to think about it is counterintuitive and almost impossible. Now, mindfulness can also be about acknowledging these thoughts, but then noting that that's exactly what they are. They're just a thought, and that they can come into your head, that they can leave just as easily. So the idea that a distressful thought can come in and we can just note it and then we can let it go. And there are many different exercises that lead you through it. And it is a skill. It's easier said than done. But that's the kind of mindfulness that I personally believe is more helpful at this time. And I will lead us through an exercise to demonstrate that. But that's what I want to say about mindfulness right now. Similarly with deep breathing. Okay, this one's probably my favorite because it seems like the easiest one, but it also has the largest impact, in my opinion. There's a lot of research behind it. So the stress response involuntarily wants to make your breath a little more shallow and a little faster. It's subtle, but it's there because it wants to prep you for either running for your life, fighting for your life, or being really, really still. The thing is, if our stress response is stimulated a lot over time, like during a pandemic, that deep breathing remains really shallow then and a little bit faster, and it can actually prime you to experience panic attacks later on. The wonderful thing about breathing is it's controlled involuntarily, but also voluntarily. We can take the reins back and slow our breath down and lengthen it out, and then send signals back to that amygdala, back to that stress response to cool it, to relax a little. And that's why I really love deep breathing, because we already do it, but we just have to be intentional about how we do it. What else? I'm going to skip grounding through the senses for now, but it is basically using our senses to come back to the present. So it's about like looking around and registering what's around you. Like, are there trees? What colors do you see? What do you smell? What do you hear? Just to get you back to the present. It's another strategy to help you get centered and not float in your anxiety up here. The next one, limiting social media news. Okay, so this one I'm very passionate about, but I know it's really challenging. We want to stay informed. It's needed. I get that. Every day things change. We want to know the updates. I empower all of you to pick like a chunk of time each day that you will do that. And if it's outside of that time, just turn it off. You know, if you are the type of person who likes to leave the TV on all day, please don't leave it on a news channel. It is just not helpful to hear the headlines churn, especially in today's world. There's like a lot of people got opinions and things that can make your stress elevate. It's just not helpful. That vicarious trauma is real. So I suggest at least limiting the time and not doing it before bed, actually. Okay. So here's some quick resources for you all. On the left are a list of phone apps that I really like. They all have different exercises for mindfulness, meditation, and deep breathing. The last two, Mood and Dailyo, are two apps that help you track your mood. If you honestly have no idea how you're doing, you're like, I don't know. I just go through my days and I hope for the best. I don't know if I'm sad or angry or frustrated or happy. Those are really great tools to track that if you're curious and you want to know. And they're all free, I will say. You pay for extra stuff, but they all have some basic things that are free. On the right are some key terms that I thought I'd offer you all to search on your own because there are different types of exercises. The first one is called Leaves on a Stream. It's a meditation about what I had said about acknowledging thoughts as they come, but then letting them go. Visualizing the distressful thought, noting that it's a thought, letting it go. So that's one you can YouTube, and there's a lot of examples. Progressive muscle relaxation is an exercise focused on different muscle groups, flexing and tensing them, and then relaxing. It is a structured way of doing it, and there's a lot of research that supports its use for better sleep for those who need something like that. You're usually seated or laying down in bed when you're doing this. And again, there's a lot of examples of it. You can kind of search for the video that you like. A lot of the apps on the left can give that to you as well. And then for those who like podcasts, because I don't know, I think that's like pretty popular these days. I like these two podcasts, 10% Happier with Dan Harris, and then Selfie, because it does talk about self-care in a way that I think is digestible, and they do offer little like interventions and different mindfulness exercises. So if you're more of like a audio podcast person, I think that's your thing. So what I want to do next, hopefully this works, I have a video that I want to show you all, and I want to lead you through a couple of minutes of deep breathing just to give you a taste of what it might be like. So when I click on the video, what you'll see is almost like a flower of circles expanding and contracting, and you are meant to follow that with your breath. There's also like visual cues, like to breathe in and to breathe out. So all I want you all to do is to follow that, to get comfortable in your seat, and then to listen to my voice, because I'm going to be giving you a couple of cues and to guide you a little bit through this exercise. Okay? So hopefully this works. Let's see. Sorry about that. I'm here. So breathe, follow the cues. And as you inhale, feel your chest expand. Feel the tension as you inhale and push it out as you exhale. Good. Inhale. And let your shoulders drop when you exhale. Notice where your thoughts are. And if they're not on my voice, gently push them there. Think about how you are seated in your chair, that you are safe in the room that you're in. Continue to breathe and feel the cool air. Push the tension out. Let your shoulders drop each time you exhale. And just slow down. Good. So I'm going to stop it. Hopefully you all were able to see that. And let me see. I need to get back out of here. I think I need my keyboard. I apologize for the technical issue. 1 second. So hopefully all of you were able to see that pretty well. I don't know if you could hear me over the music, so I apologize for that. I was trying to turn it down. That's just a very, very small taste of what deep breathing can be like. Usually it lasts for at least 15 minutes. I'll lead clients through it for a long time, but I just wanted to give you a sense of even what it can feel like to slow your breath down and to try. And it might not be as easy as it seems, because it is a skill. The thing about deep breathing is it really is most beneficial if you can practice often and over time. It's almost like an antidepressant, which antidepressants only really work if you take them consistently, daily, and over like a couple of months. Deep breathing is the same, except it's not a pill and it's free and it's natural. So I always recommend clients like try that first. So I really wanted to be able to give you guys a little taste of that. Okay, so moving on. As I mentioned, I wanted to go over coping in the same ways I talked about the responses. So first, with cognitive coping, how can we manage those anxious thoughts? So the first tip, I guess, that I wanted to highlight will sound like pretty obvious, but if you think about it, I think it's really helpful. When we worry and we have a lot of stress, we tend to feel like it engulfs our entire life, that there's no way out of it. There's nothing else. There's nothing else except for that stress. The thing is, worry thoughts are just that. They are thoughts, you know, like how mindfulness tries to prompt you to think. And with any thought, it's temporary. It won't last forever. And even though the issue in and of itself might not go away when your thought goes away, it's usually the thought or the emotion that causes most of the distress. You know, if you really think about it, next time you're feeling really upset, ask yourself, like, what is actually happening around me? And what is the thing that's actually making me feel upset or out of control? Often, it's the thought. So reminding yourself that it's temporary, you want to validate it. I don't want to dismiss how we think, but to acknowledge that, okay, it doesn't last forever though, that can give us some comfort. The next one, anxiety journaling, I really like. It's counterintuitive, but I think it's pretty clever. This involves chunking a part of your day only for worrying. So maybe like 30 minutes where all you do is worry. You can write it down, you can think about it, you can talk about it to your heart's content. Now the trick is, outside of that chunk of time, you're not really allowed to. You're not allowed to ruminate. So if you find yourself worrying, you have to remind yourself, like, okay, you know what? I know that's a thought, I know that's a worry, but I'm gonna give that my all tomorrow at 3 o'clock during my worry time. I'm gonna worry the heck out of it, and I will run into the ground, all the worst case scenarios. I'm gonna do it then. Right now, I'm gonna have to do my work. I'm gonna have to talk to these families. I have to figure out how I wanna open up again. But tomorrow, oh God, like I'm going to worry like for that 30 minutes, all for that. And what you will find, or what I have found a lot with clients, is by the time they get to their worry part of the day, they have forgotten about a lot of what they wanted to worry about. A lot of people struggle to fill in 30 minutes of worrying time when they know that's the only thing they can think about. So I think that puts into perspective that once again, these worry thoughts can feel like they can control us and control our days, but they don't have to. And there's ways to just detach from it long enough to allow you to reground and focus on the work that you're trying to do. What else? So I'll lump noticing the good in the world and then finding lightness and humor in each day together. I know that sounds pretty obvious, but also a little invalidating because there's a lot of scary things happening too. So how can you ask us to look for the good, right? So what I mean by that is absolutely acknowledge the hardships of what we're going through right now. I can imagine some of the decisions some of you are trying to make as Colorado opens back up, and what feels safest. What, I have responsibilities. I'm looking after children. Of course, that's going to take up time and space. What I'm suggesting is to also intentionally make space to remind yourself of what's still going okay, what is still good, that it's okay to laugh still, even during a time like this, to find humor, to smile. And when we do that, it really relieves some tension in our heads. When we're in a negative space the whole time, it's exhausting. And if we can prompt ourselves to even list a few good things, it can really change our frame of reference. The last one, finding the lesson. I also really like when I work with trauma survivors. The thing is, what's happening now can't be changed. What has happened also can't be changed. We're kind of in it, and that's hard to accept. However, I find that with every, awful thing that happens, usually we can look back and pull something from it that we can use moving forward. Yes, it can be a silver lining, but it can also be kind of neutral, just something that you would not have learned or experienced if it weren't for this awful thing. And if it had to happen, then at least maybe you can pull something from it to use moving forward to continue growth or progress in whatever way that you see fit. Now, I know this is harder to do when the thing that's happening isn't over yet, like the pandemic, but since it is so complex, I would believe that there are probably a lot of small lessons that we can learn already. And to take note of that and to remember and not let the stress bury that. So emotional coping, this one's probably my favorite one. I love emotions, obviously, as a therapist. But the first one, probably I hold closest to me. I think it's really difficult to do, but so human. So it's called riding the wave. I think especially in the US, in our culture, we tend to want to bury emotions and push them down, or have a lot of negative judgment with emotions in general. And the thing is, we can try to do that and it might work for a while, but usually it finds a way out. It will manifest somehow because we're human and we feel, and emotions are important. They signal to us what do we care about, what might be threatening, and it's important data. So when I talk about emotion, like writing emotions, what I mean by that is letting them come up and identifying what they are. Like, what is this thing that I'm feeling? Can you differentiate between sadness and anger? Now, doing this in therapy is a little bit different than doing it on your own, but I think the concept stands. What I'll say about this, though, is, okay, maybe you don't want to write the emotion out when you're leading a bunch of children in a program, or when you're talking to families about your business. I get that. There is a time and place, sure. And when you do have that space, though, I would empower all of you to just let some of the emotions surface more and challenge yourself to name it. Can you name it? And then write it out. Instead of trying to stop the grief, feel it. And the thing about that is, just like the thoughts, emotions also don't last forever. And being able to write it out will empower you to feel that you do have that control, that you're not going to lose control just because you feel intensely, that you're not going to go crazy by feeling some emotions. It might feel hard. It might feel really difficult, yes, but it also you won't live there. And by being able to write it out, I actually think it gives people a better sense of control and not so afraid of their emotions. Self-compassion, this one's a big one too, to be kind to ourselves, that you're doing your best. Like I mentioned at the beginning, just because you feel a certain way doesn't mean that you're bad. And this goes specifically with guilt and shame. I think those two are salient emotions that a lot of us are feeling right now as we navigate how to open the economy back up, especially for childcare providers like yourselves. You know, when you're thinking about kids and families and your own, it feels like that's a lot of pressure. And it is the thing. And we don't have right answers, not yet. And you're asked to make really difficult decisions that can spark a lot of different emotions. So I suggest like noting that and being kind to ourselves, that no one really knows exactly what they're doing. We're not all into talking about our emotions, which I get. So I encourage people to try other ways of expression, whether that's through art, through poetry, dance, photography, you know, like just like children, right? They don't always have the verbal ability to express how they feel. They will find a way to tell you. They will find a way to express it. And as adults, we can do the same thing. It doesn't have to be verbally. So I just didn't want people to forget that. And of course, like therapy, I just have to do a plug in there for therapy in general. Therapy is good for all of this, but especially if, say, you weren't, maybe you weren't raised in a place or weren't taught that emotions and naming them were okay. Maybe there was some shaming involved in that. That's pretty common, I think. Therapy can be a nice, safe, protected space to start learning how to do that. It's definitely not easy, but it can be so powerful. I speak from personal experience as a therapist and as someone who has practiced this stuff. Okay. And then the bodily / behavioral coping. I think the first thing I want to say is routine is super important. And my guess is, as people in your business and childcare providers, you understand that probably. We like predictability. We like some kind of consistency day to day. And when the pandemic happened, it was turned like upside down, but we can still implement that routine. My guess is a lot of you probably already have this, but I want to reinforce it. That is really important, especially the morning and evening routines to help transition. All of you probably are familiar with that as well, with helping like younger people go from one thing to another. One trick I like is called chunking. So this is for people who are really struggling to think about their schedules day to day. They feel really overwhelmed. Things change so often, it's hard to know what's going to happen next month or even tomorrow. So when that happens, A trick I like to do is to look at my life in smaller parts. So when I don't know what to do in a day, I chunk into the 3 hour mark. What am I going to do from 9 to noon? What's my to-do list from 9 to noon? Because if you're like me, you have a list of things just like to do, like in life, and that can go on for a really long time. You got to prioritize it. If you're really type A like me, maybe there's like different colors. But when you look at all of that, it's like, oh my God, where do you even start? So chunking, thinking like, what am I going to do in like 2 hours? That can be much more doable, much more digestible, and it's very helpful for our brain, the frontal lobe, to only think about that at a time. So that's like one trick I like to do. And you can chunk it however you want. It can be 3 hours in a day, which I like to do, 9 to 12, 12 to 3, 3 to 6. It could be a week at a time, whatever works for you. I already talked about movement. Please do it daily if you can, even if it's walking around talking on your phone. That's better than being too sedentary. We need to like release that muscle tension to get the circulation going. It just feels healthier. The find and create your own retreat. If you're working from home, or if you have been, if you have a family, if you have a partner, the boundaries are probably really blurred. Maybe you're working well into the night. Maybe you have a kid on your lap now when you have meetings. Maybe you're just like weaving in and out, between the two. Maybe you're wearing sweatpants on the bottom. You got your business suit up top. Like it's just all mixed together. And I get that. That does make sense. When it comes to self-care, it should be much more intentional. And one way to do it is to designate an area in your home or your office once you go back that's meant to do whatever self-care you want to do. So for me, it's actually this chair. I like this chair a lot. I have memories of it from like middle school, so there's some nostalgia. So I sit in it for self-care. I'm doing it for this presentation because it's the only chair that works for this, but typically I'm only sitting in it to read or to listen to music, and I don't do anything else in it except give this presentation. Okay, I'm gonna keep going. So I know this webinar is self-care for you all, but as childcare providers, as family, as parents, as I'm sure a lot of you are, I want to just throw in a couple of things about considerations with kids. You probably already well aware of all of that, so maybe I'm just reinforcing, which is great. But I do just want to say that, for children with the pandemic, even if they don't have the words or the cognitive capacity to really understand what exactly is happening, I'm sure you all know that they can pick up on it in their own way. They get something is different. They understand they're staying at home for a reason. So we can expect some behavioral issues as a result because it's difficult to adapt. And again, they might not have the words to express it, so they might act out instead. Again, I'm imagining I'm preaching to the choir for this one, but I did want to name that because I know that can be hard when you're 2 months into quarantine and you're still around it. It can really wear down your own resources. So I guess related to that, just to focus on extra play and focus on safety and attachment, just being there and being consistent is what kids need the most right now. Okay, let me check time here. All right, good. So that was a really quick overview of coping. I'm realizing now that was probably a little quick, but I wanted to just highlight a couple of suggestions and interventions with each bucket. So what I have left are just a couple of final comments, but please feel free to ask me questions or email later. So I want to really bring home the point that we are living with a lot of loss right now and living with a lot of loss of control. And the thing about loss is it's pretty universal. We all go through some kind of loss eventually, but very rarely is it happening on such a large scale and so collectively and in so many different ways. It's not very common at all. I think 9/11 is probably another time that we experience that. But I will argue that this one actually feels more pervasive because there's no set end. And we don't even know the extent of the reach of it yet. And I want us to keep that in mind, just to have the context as to why this can feel hard sometimes, to stave off any judgment or feelings of guilt and shame of like, how come I'm not better yet? Like it's been 2 months. Like, how come I can't figure this out? Well, because it's very, very unprecedented what's going on. Oh, and then of course, the idea that we're constantly reminded by these losses, and there's literally no escape from it. There is nowhere on this planet that we can go right now where we can like not be exposed, like literally but metaphorically, to what's happening. And that is a very trapped feeling and very uncomfortable. That speaks back to that sense of unease. And so this is just a list that I wanted to share with you all of examples of things that we do not have control over, and yet some things that we do. This goes back to the routine comment, you know, like trauma is about losing control. Stress is about not having the control we want. And the thing is, in any situation, there's always something, a little something that we can control. So I encourage all of you to figure out what that looks like in your life and control the heck out of it if you can. Some days it might be successful, some days maybe not, but identify what that is for you. And I wrote down like just a couple of thoughts about what that might be. And it can be different for different people. Okay. Just a couple more. So easing expectations. I saw this quote floating around social media back in March, and it almost gave me a heart attack. If you're not mastering that hobby, deep cleaning every inch of your house, or working toward ultimate goals during this time, you'll know it was never out of lack of time, it was laziness. Yikes. No, 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 no. First of all, if you are one of the people who are being quite productive right now, and maybe even thriving, there's like a subpopulation right now that are doing quite well. That's great. Power to you. And that is not the expectation for any of you. For me, for Michael, nobody. You are doing the best you can because we are in a pandemic. This is not by choice. Your stress response is very activated, for some of us, maybe even more so. And we cannot expect ourselves to cope perfectly and to like get all this done. I think it's just, it sets us up for failure, and it's not helpful. You're going through more than you realize. You know, that stress response is involuntary. Remember that. You're not thinking about the fact that you're prepping to keep yourself alive. And then the last point there about maintenance of progress made so far is progress, I think is a nice reframe. If you're not feeling like you're going like this right now, like every day is just better than the last, maybe it's like this and then like flatlining a little bit. If it's not going down like that, that's still progress. That's still something to celebrate and to self-validate and acknowledge. And then finally, just giving grace to ourselves and each other. You know, we're all going through the same thing. Yes, it's impacting different people differently. I will acknowledge that. But let's keep that in mind. It can be really challenging, I think, to be empathic these days because we're all really navigating new territory. But I like to try to take a step back once in a while to remind myself that, okay, and no one else really knows either. So try to give the benefit of the doubt when you can, and that includes to yourself. So, oh, and these are my references, by the way. I love all of these. These are very, very good, especially the stuff on the bottom. They're actual like workbooks and booklets with more skills in them if you're interested. They're quite good. So I'm hoping that the technological side went well on all of your end, but thank you so much for having me. I hope something I said resonated with you, and that there were like maybe a couple of little things that you can take back with you and use. My email is there. I'd be happy to answer questions. And like Michael said, he's gonna, I think, post this for all of you so you go back over in your own time. But yeah, thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Ella. Yeah, I actually, it's funny, I came into this with the whole list of questions to ask you, things around resources and things like that, and you basically answered all of them. The only one that I still had was just, you provided so many of these resources for what we can do at home, but for those individuals, either for the reasons you discussed or just those that may feel they may need more help, how would you suggest going about finding a therapist if they've never done that before?
Really good question. Um, okay, the main search engine I would recommend is actually psychologytoday.com. I like it because you can filter by insurance. If you have a preference for your therapist to be a specific gender, you can filter that way, and by presenting concern and location, of course. And there's little bios there, and you can read them. And I would just recommend starting with people that resonate with you. You know, it's kind of weird. It's almost like online dating. You're like, do I have a good vibe from this person? Do they have what I'm looking for? And I would listen to that gut. But yeah, that search engine is where I would start with. Because then you can also ask that person that you talk to for referrals if it ends up not being a good fit or they don't have availability.
Wonderful. Thank you, Ella.
No
Just because
problem.
we are low on time, the only thing
Yeah.
that I feel maybe we should do with this last minute is if anybody does have anything particularly small that they're grateful for, please feel free to just share it in the chat. I'll share mine. Here he is. He just makes sure every day is
Oh.
so, we're so thankful for having you with us, Ella. And again, this is going to be something that I envision some of us will watch more than once because, there's a lot of great information here. And, when we send out this email, please feel free to forward it on to other people because a lot of people can benefit from this. So thank you
Yeah,
so much, Ella.
no problem. Thank you for having me, everyone.
All right. Well, I'm going to close up the meeting then. Thank you, everybody, and we'll see you next week.
Okay, thank you.